This week on the agenda, migration emergency. What does the crisis in Ceuta really tell us about how Europe is controlling its borders? Chaos, desperation, exhaustion. Men, women and children swimming, wading, forcing their way over the fences between Morocco and Spain, the largest single crossing in Ceuta's history. Spain's Interior Ministry says around 50,000 people crossed in days. At least 141 people are reported to have died trying. Brussels praised Spain's handling of the crisis, but within days, 22 EU states signed a letter attacking Madrid's plans, and Italy shut its own borders with Spain entirely. In 2015, more than 1 million people reached Europe by sea in a single year, the continent's worst refugee crisis since World War II. Since then, that number has been falling, dropping 26% last year to under 180,000, a fraction of the 2015 total. But falling numbers haven't cooled the politics. For years, governments across Europe have promised that illegal immigration is their top priority, and each new crisis has pushed the far right further into the political mainstream. Joining me now are Anna Terrón Cusí, Senior Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and Spain's former Secretary of State for Immigration and Emigration. Dr. Isabelle Schäfer, Research Fellow at DGAP's Centre for Migration. Beatriz de León Cobo, Director of the Spanish Institute for the Analysis of Migration, and Dr. Omer Shatz, Co-Director of front-LEX. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. Anna, let me start with you. Ceuta's been breached before in 2021, and now this. What is actually different this time?
I think that this time what is different is the scale, is the role that social media played in, and it's the very, very, very short time in which that happened. I think the three elements are rather new. I also think that the context and the geopolitical context, it is new. We do not have to forget that the reality in the Mediterranean at this very moment is totally different after Iran and the United States crisis and other moves that make geopolitics much more complicated. So I think that's really different from the last time that happened in Ceuta.
We will dig into some of those geopolitical influences as the conversation develops. But Isabelle, let me bring you in because your research shows that Morocco's underlying goal is winning international backing for its claim over Western Sahara. Is migration control actually a bargaining chip or for something else entirely?
Well, European countries and the European Union make it quite clear and obvious that the control of irregular migration is one of their key priorities, and that does give countries outside the European Union some leverage. And Morocco is certainly a key migration partner for European countries, and it's not only a country of origin, but also a country of transit for people trying to reach Europe, and also increasingly a country that receives migrants as well. Now, I do not want to speculate as to the reasons behind what happened in Ceuta. As Anna Terrón said, the situation is very different from a few years ago, and there's still a lot that we do not know. But I can speak as to Morocco's general goals and interests, and geopolitics do play a considerable role. Morocco does claim sovereignty over Ceuta and Melilla, for example, but the country also has a strong economic development goal. And in terms of migration, this means promoting legal migration, particularly of young people, and also to cultivate an image of being a reliable partner, both for European and African countries. And the images from Ceuta do not promote this image. And controlling their own borders for security reasons is actually another priority for Morocco itself. And what we've seen in the past few years is that diplomatic relations with European countries have improved, and Morocco has been proactively engaging with European countries on migration topics, including legal migration and irregular migration. And the border cooperation between Spain and Morocco is usually actually very close. In some cases, they even have joint patrols and police stations. And although it is unclear how so many people were able to cross into Ceuta, I think at least the quick return of the majority of people who entered Ceuta illustrates that usually close cooperation.
It's so interesting what you're saying is that the pictures that we're seeing out of Ceuta often tell a very different story. I mean, Beatrice, if you look at the numbers, crossings across Europe are actually down overall. Why does a single dramatic crisis like this do more political damage than a slow decline ever did?
Actually, because unfortunately, numbers do not necessarily matter in migration policy. What matters is perception of control, especially now in Europe on the times that we live. So as you were mentioning before, I think Frontex was saying the other day that on the first half of the year, 37% of crossings down in Spain, 32% of crossings down on the first half of the year. So clearly, you can see that the numbers are dropping in terms of illegal crossings. But when you see 50 to 70,000 people crossing to Spain, so Ceuta, therefore in Europe, in one single day, it doesn't really matter of those statistics for the regular person, for the media, even for the politicians. Unfortunately, a gradual reduction, it's invisible, but a crisis of this magnitude is very visible. And this is exactly what happened. One expects in migration policy, especially when working with partners, some sort of predictability, visibility, transparency, early warning. You see all of those mechanisms that you think are going to ensure that something like this does not happen. And as always, unfortunately, when it happens, once it did happen in a different scale in 2021, but it has happened in a much larger scale now. People wonder, can this happen again? If it happens, can we have the same reaction capacity? Because actually most of the migrants have gone back, right? But because most of them were Moroccans, what would have happened if there were sub-Saharan Africans where we don't have an arrangement where the countries of origin to do what we've done with Morocco, right? So it poses a lot of questions and a lot of perceptions that I think unfortunately are not necessarily accurate, because overall, as we are saying, trends are down. Nevertheless, this is a huge red flag for migration policy and for cooperation, where clearly something has not worked as it should have, and we should do a good analysis of what has happened and ensure that it doesn't happen again, especially now because there's a lot of rumors in social media that something like this might happen in a few days. So clearly it's something that is very high up in the agenda of Spain and Europe.
I want to stick with that notion of different perceptions. I mean, Omer, Brussels praised Spain's handling of what happened in Ceuta, and then 22 states signed a letter attacking it days later. What actually changed in those few days?
Well, I suggest not to fall into like the obvious traps here in our discussion, because there is no real difference between the Brussels, what you call the EU Commission and so on, and the member states. They all have the same position, the same goal. Only the nuances are different, because the member states are typically using this crisis, and maybe it's worthwhile also to say something about this crisis for their own political ends, especially the populist right parties and so on. And this is maybe the most important, or the point of departure of our discussion, in my view, should be that this is not a migratory crisis, right? This is a geopolitical crisis that was instrumentalizing and manipulating tens of thousands of people. More than 100 of them lost their lives, we have to remember. It was a social media campaign that was by some secret services. It's yet to be investigated if it was Algeria, if it was the US, if it was Israel, if it was... But obviously what we saw are not asylum seekers, as my colleague Beatriz was saying, sub-Saharan ones mostly that are seeking asylum and international protection, but mostly were Moroccan nationals that heard that the border is open and were incited and encouraged to cross the border. So it's not at all about migration. It's not at all about... It's about geopolitical instrumentalization of migration. EU external migration policy has two objectives. One, to prevent arrivals to EU shores at all costs, and two, to remain unaccountable for the means that they are using to this end, to prevent their arrival. So the EU will not be legally accountable, not before the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, not before the EU Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and even not before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And how they do it? By externalization, outsourcing. So agreements with third countries like Morocco, and Libya, Tunisia, and so on, Turkey, the EU-Turkey deal, everything is similar across the EU external border.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Anna, because Omer talking there about it being a success story, but also mentioning that the people who are still in Ceuta are in dire conditions. Of course, we have to think about the people who lost their lives with this perilous crossing. But if we look at it, is it fair on Spain, this sort of ganging up on one country, rather than agreeing on a real, complete, Europe-wide policy? Because that seems to be what's missing.
Well, first of all, let me say that what I do think is that was not fair, absolutely not fair on the European Union itself. I mean, it's a crazy and damaging game for the European Union. Spain is a country which has a different narrative, and I say Spain has a different narrative about migration, and it had a different narrative since since some few years ago. And the Spanish government has a different narrative about migration, but, and there is a big but, in terms of border control, Spain is a hardliner. I mean, if you look at the Ceuta border, it's 8 kilometers of a fence that would be the dream of Donald Trump. I mean, it's a very secure fence. It's also a fence that has been contested by human rights and civil rights organizations. There is a hard-line border control policy in the south of Spain. In addition to that, let me say that there is that Spain invested a lot of political capital in adopting the European Pact for Migration. It was adopted under the Spanish presidency, and the pact, it's basically an agreement for border control. And Spain will stick to that, irrespectively of the different narrative and the different interior policies on migration, the regularization, etc. Going back to the idea that this is not fair at all for the European Union, what I think is that will happen again in Spain or in another territory, and taking into consideration the two dimensions of that crisis, the geopolitical, which I think that it's the main one, and the migratory part of this geopolitical crisis, I think Europe has to react in a very different way. Yeah. I was not so surprised about the two steps. One, looking at Spain and talking to own citizens, and the second one reacting as the European Union should react. But still, I do think that in between, the European Union has lost a lot of political capital. It's normal, it happens, but taking into consideration the scale and taking into consideration the geopolitical context of this crisis, I think that a lesson to be learned by the European Union is that this game cannot be played again.
So Isabelle, I'd like to bring you back in. Who is really in charge of European immigration as things stand?
Well, as things stand in theory, the European Union and European member states share their powers when it comes to immigration policy. And European institutions, which of course include member states, with the Council, for example, decide on common rules and laws. And just recently, the reform of the common European asylum system entered into force, which Anna Terrón just mentioned, and European member states have to implement that reform. And on the other side, European member states have the final say on visa applications, for example. Now, what we have seen is that some member states go their own way. We've seen Germany, for example, in the past years constantly renewing border controls at its land borders, even though the maximum duration should not exceed 2 years, and even though the Commission recently recommended to phase out these border controls. And what we've also seen is that national politics and interests do play a role in European migration diplomacy with countries outside the European Union. My colleagues just recently published a study on the EU migration deals, and they found that many deals are pushed by specific member states. Italy, in the case of the EU deal with Tunisia, Spain, in the case of Mauritania, and Cyprus, in the case of Lebanon. So as always, there's theory and then there's practice. Ideally, European countries decide on common rules and apply them together, but migration is a politically contentious issue and national politics do play a role. And I think the political reactions to what happened in Ceuta show that.
Beatriz, would you agree with that? I mean, to be effective, immigration policy, by default, needs to feature cooperation. Are we seeing enough of that cooperation?
Well, right now, especially given that another member state decided to put a Schengen restriction into another member state, I'll see the cooperation is not in the highest moment, unfortunately. But clearly, if we stop thinking about the diplomatic or the political gesture after the crisis and we see it as a whole, clearly, we need cooperation within the European Union and outside the European Union. And actually, I think Spain is quite a good example of that, especially when we're talking about external cooperation. I know what happened with Morocco is quite shocking, and I really hope, first of all, it doesn't happen again, and second of all, whatever happened that produced the lacks of control and the lacks of intelligence sharing for this crisis does not happen again. But if not, cooperation with Morocco, but especially Mauritania and Senegal, have been incredibly good over the last few years. So good that, for example, the Canary Island route that in 2024 was practically the highest in the whole European Union is one of the lowest right now in terms of especially percentage. So clearly we are doing a good job cooperating with countries, especially to ensure, as always, that whomever decides to migrate does it as the European Union says in a safe way, right? Instead of what has happened, the tragic 100 deaths of what we've just seen in Ceuta. Nevertheless, Ceuta demonstrates the vulnerability, right, of the cooperation exclusively with external partners. So I think internally the migration pact of migration of asylum was good that finally is in application, and I think the law is there, and I think cooperation is there through the countries, but exactly precisely in crisis is where I wonder if cooperation is as effective as it should be, or if we should have much more solidarity, because when Ceuta happened, I have not necessarily seen a lot of solidarity externally or internally within the European Union or outside the European Union. No? So these are exactly moments where I wonder up to what point that cooperation in a moment of crisis like this one is actually working. But nevertheless, as I repeated in some communiques I did after this crisis, I think this is an opportunity to learn, especially in the moments where we have a challenge and a crisis as this one, how to have solidarity among us, and especially how to work better and share responsibility and burden, because the moment there is a crisis in Poland, we are also expect Spain to be there and help, right? So at the end, we are a European Union, and we should face our challenges and opportunities together as we usually do, and we are just challenged by what happened in Ceuta, but truly hoping we can do it much better for the next time, and the same goes for our external partners. This just cannot happen again.
I mean, Omer, big questions there around solidarity, around unity, and we've already seen some of the vulnerabilities of supposed cooperation exposed. You know, with Italy and Spain having these tit-for-tat exchanges in terms of how open their border crossings are, tweaking their policies. What do you make of that?
So yeah, I mean, as we said, Ceuta, just as Ceuta is an exception legally and geopolitically and geographically, also Spain, this Spanish government is, as my colleague said, is an exception in its policy vis-a-vis migration, especially the ones who already enter Spain, the regularization, and also in other respects. And this is precisely why this government was targeted by this campaign in an attempt to destabilize this government, because on their colonial blind spot, which is Ceuta, dating back to the 15th century, and so on. And Italy, of course, is the paradigmatic example for the populist political instrumentalization and using migration for political ends, because of course they don't share any border, only airports, and therefore the only border checks they can impose is at airports. And as we said, no one was transferred from Ceuta to Spain in any event, and so on. So on Italy, I don't have much to say. What I can say is that when we talk about cooperation and collaboration between the member states, we have to remember one thing. We often target what we call the frontline member states, namely Spain, Greece. I mean, in our public media, in our focus in the public sphere, Spain, Italy, Greece, and so on. But these frontline member states are always operating. Their modus operandi is always what we call joint operation with an agency that is called Frontex, the EU Border and Coast Guard Agency. And this agency, Frontex, is composed of all the other 27 or 26 member states. So it's easy. The usual suspect will be Spain or Greece or Italy if we talk about the Mediterranean, but essentially they are operating under the edges of a different apparatus of power composed of all the 27 member states, including Italy, if you wish, in this case. And it's their assets, it's their boats, it's their drones, it's their agents, and so on. So it's to a large extent, again, it's just a political friction with no any meaning legally or otherwise between the member state and Brussels, or between the member states and themselves. And more broadly to your question, I would say all member states, their interest and their collaboration, they converge on the external borders policy, no? And they diverge once people are entering, and they have to show solidarity and of resettlement and collaboration and cooperation and so on. So internally they diverge, externally they converge. And here in Spain, a paradigmatic example of contracting with third countries, third safe countries, like Morocco, and externalizing their human rights obligations to these countries. The only problem is that you cannot delegate your own responsibility. You can outsource certain border control functions to third countries. You can, under very strict conditions, you can. But you remain liable for all the obligations you have undertaken in different human rights treaties, like the right to live, the right to asylum, the right not to be refoulé, the right to not to be collectively expelled, to have individual screening. So when my colleague said there are sub-Saharans, there are Moroccans, we don't know. They were all collectively expulsed. There were sub-Saharans. I know of people from Yemen who were in this event. I know of people from Sudan and Egypt that were in these events. And so it's not only Moroccans, and the lack of individual screening, individual assessment is a gross violation of Spain on the prohibition and collective expulsion, on refoulement, and on torture.
I want to talk a little bit about who's setting the tone in immigration policy in Europe. Anna, Marine Le Pen's national rally is already using Ceuta in its messaging, and Germany's AfD could win its first state election in the East this autumn. Is the far right now setting Europe's immigration agenda rather than just reacting to crises like this one?
Well, I think it is very important to try to divide the two scenarios when we're talking about migration. The first would be politics, and the second one, policies. And I think that this happens in many other issues, from climate change to security. But in migration, it's extremely different what you can say if you analyze politics and what you can say if you analyze policies. So going to the politics area, I would say that images are extremely powerful. And we have all seen 100 more times the images of the young boys getting into Ceuta than the images of the people leaving Ceuta by their own 36 hours later. So this can be easily used as the picture of an EU invasion by young Moroccan North Saharan guys. That's completely out of the context, because if we go to reality, Ceuta is a very special place. Omer was talking about that. Ceuta, it's very particular. These people will never get into the Schengen area because Ceuta is excluded from Schengen. And if you ask me, is this an invasion? Is this something that can create a panic situation in Germany or France? Absolutely not. but this is in the area of policies, not in the area of politics. What this people is doing is using migration, and the list I can say is that that's not new. That's not at all new in Europe, and that can always happen. You will always have an image of people getting into a border. Let me tell you something I explain to my students. I use the wording of the newspapers of Syria crisis in 2015 and the ones of some years before, talking about the post-revolution in Tunisia and the arrival of 20,000 people from Tunisia to Italy. Highlights are exactly portraying the same. I mean, same wording, same tension, same. They were portraying the situation in the same alarming way. What can we do against that? The only thing we can do against that is ask responsible people to be responsible. What is the extreme right wing doing? Using not migration, and I'm sorry to say that, but I think that we have to be extremely clear on that. They're not using migration, they are using something which is older and which name is racism. And racism have been used all along centuries in very different situations. There's no urgent cure for that. And we have to be capable to face this very situation. But it's not about migration policies, although people obviously have the right to see their borders under control and to see that the governments are controlling the situations. But we are in a different game, and we have to face this in a very political and social, with very political and social tools.
It's interesting you say that the rhetoric hasn't changed, but that there has been a shift and that things are different. I mean, you know, and one of those shifts, Isabelle, let me talk to you about this. A Chinese analyst has said that migration is no longer just policy, but he's described it as a political weapon tied to election outcomes. Is that a fair description of where Europe is right now?
Well, we can certainly see a shift towards more restrictive measures Europe-wide. I mean, the recent reform of the common European asylum system is one example. The new return regulation is another. But I think there are two aspects that are important to keep in mind. One is that border controls and the attempt to externalize migration policies is not new, and Terrón was mentioning some of it as well. Quickly after, for example, the We Can Do It movement in Germany in 2015, Germany introduced border controls with Austria. They're still going on to this day, and the deal between the EU and Turkey was concluded shortly after that in 2016. So this is not new, but it has become more mainstream. And the second thing is the situation is different compared to 11 years ago when this We Can Do It moment in Germany happened. And since then, there has been a pandemic with its economic impact, as well as the Russian attack on Ukraine, with millions of Ukrainians being received by the EU. And Germany has taken in, for example, over 1 million of them. And of course, in 2015, the AfD was not part of the German parliament. So parties in the center are reacting to this new situation.
Isabelle Schäfer, Beatriz de León Cobo, Omer Shatz and Terrón Cusí, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, China Shock 2.0. What's the rest of the world making of the country's technological advance? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.